So let's get started. The first technique we're going to use is to paint with the pastels. I'm creating different shades of blue for the sky. And I do this by scraping PanPastel pigment into a dish and adding water. Here we have a dark blue, white with a hint of turquoise, and a light blue. What's great about mixing the paint is that we can always come back to it for another painting and revitalize it. So a lot of these colors I'll be reusing in the next two drawings. Next thing we're going to do is to add a few more details to our drawings because I want to create a movement of water. Now I have my outlines. I'm going to use a scoring tool to create some indents. Then I'm going to erase the pencil lines because when I do the painting I don't really want them showing through. In order to preserve the white of the paper, I'm going to add a bit of glue to the waves and to the eye of the fish. But while that's drying, let's do the sky. I'm going to paint a gradient with my pastel paint. This technique just shows you how versatile pastels are. By painting with them, you can cover large areas in a quick amount of time, and once the pastels dry, you can build up rich layers on top of it. Such a nice medium and oh so versatile. Now that the glue is dry, we can paint over the water area and we can actually see the waves showing through. A dry paper towel will help us soak up excess pigment. Now let's layer on a little yellow pigment. Now look at that, we have some texture and some color variation. Another fun thing with PanPastels and pastels is that you can lift the color. In this instance, I'm using a wet applicator to create some details, but more on lifting pigment later. A little yellow in the sky and I think we've completed our background. Now onto the fish. So again we're using blue greens and a bit of yellow for the fish's underbelly. Again we're building up colours slowly. We don't want to lay down all the colour at once because we want to see different colours showing through from underneath. Let's add some more colour to the tail, building it up slowly as we go. Another layer of yellow to the body and more layers of green. Just like with any other paint, you can lay on pastel paint as thickly or as thinly as you like. Let's lay on a couple of more layers of yellow. And then let's add a bit of red to the mouth of the fish. Now I'm laying on the scales, taking advantage of the size and the shape of the paintbrush. I can get some thick textures by dipping it into my pastel paint and then dabbing it onto my pastel palette. Now here we go, we can actually use gouache or acrylic with soft pastels. Here I'm using it to create some highlights on the fish. The next thing we're going to do is use our trusted coloured pencil to create some details to make that fish stand out just that little bit more. I do have some pastel pencils, but I'll be using those in the drawings coming up. Coloured pencils are really useful in giving that extra punch to your drawings. If a coloured pencil isn't quite doing the job, a touch of gouache will really come in handy. I used white gouache to highlight the eyes, gills and scales. Now let's add some gouache to the waves, and our water is done. And now the fun part, actually taking off the masking tape. This is so rewarding. Here we go. Now, as I stand here observing the drawing, I'm noticing that something doesn't seem to be working. So here's the beauty of pastels. It's so easy to work with it. You can actually erase. So this technique, again, we're using our eraser just to fix things, to make it work. I'm using the eraser to lighten the underbelly, and guess what? That red mouth of the fish is just not working for me. Now we can definitely put the erasing technique to use. So from this to this, I like it. Voila, look at that. We can still see a little bit of the red pigment underneath, as is the case, but I think it looks so much better. And that little red actually, well, I think adds something to the fish. Job well done. In our next drawing, we're going to be using lots of tools and techniques to create a lovely flower. But first, we're going to start with a watercolor background. Laying down a watercolor base is a really useful technique when using soft or pan pastels. Let's dampen the paper and use a wet on wet technique to create our background. Using a watercolor background will help us reserve our pastels for our main character. Okay, so you might see something that looks like a moon in the top left-hand corner. Now, I was just trying out the pastel on the watercolor background just to make sure the pastel will show up on the painted background. I think we could make the background a little darker, but we'll come back to that later. In the meantime, I'm using a brush pen to paint the details of my flower. I think this is my favorite new tool. Here I'm using some of the paint from my previous drawing to shade in parts of my flower. Now I'm using a stick of really nice, soft, rich pastel to do the interior of the petal. And the Q-tip comes in really handy for blending. You can see me switching from one tool to another, and as you work with pastels, you'll discover the tools that you like working with best. And this brush pen, well, it's great for doing thin lines and details and making those really small dots that we use for creating that pointillism effect. Oh, and no water needed here. This particular paper is actually different to the first paper that I used. It's a little bit grainy and a little bit thinner. It's more like a thicker sketchbook paper. So we're definitely going to get a different result. You'll see at the end of this drawing just how much the paper affects the look of the drawing. So let's create the center of the flower using pointillism. That is lots of fine dots. The center is going to be mainly yellow, but with a dash of orange and red just to bump up the color a little. And then we're going to add some white dots for the highlights. There are many ways to mix pastels. You can mix it directly on the paper, or you can mix it on a piece of separate paper, or you can actually mix the colors directly from one palette to another. Remember, it's pretty easy to clean the PanPastel simply by wiping the top of them with a piece of paper towel. A sharp pastel pencil is great for creating lines on the flower. The edge of the applicator is super useful for filling in the leaves and making thin lines along the edge of the stem. Stenciling is a super way to apply soft pastels. This particular stencil has circles of varying sizes and it's great for creating a bokeh effect. In order to make my flower stand out from the background, I'm using a rich turquoisey blue around the flower. In order to get in between the petals, I'm using the edge of my applicator. And my fingers are a great tool for just smoothing out the edges and blending. You'll see that I'm doing a lot of back and forth with all the different tools just to get the right effect for my drawing. Okay, let's add a few more stencils to the background. If you notice here, I laid down a piece of paper towel just to stop the pastel from getting all over my hand. This is one thing you have to be very conscious of when you're using pastels. It's a little bit messy, but a paper towel or a sheet of paper will stop your hands from smudging already completed areas. So there we have it. Look at that. I really like the effect that we achieved with this flower. The paper has created a nice, soft, subtle effect. So it truly demonstrates how the paper you use affects your drawing. So the third and final drawing is this beautiful little garden snail. Let's mask the edges with some tape. Next, I'm going to apply a little glue to selected areas of this textured paper. You'll notice that I've used a brown pencil to shade in the swirls on the snail shell. This will make it so much easier to follow the pattern once I start shading in the colour. Remember the pastel paint that I made for the first two drawings? Well, here I've repurposed it and remixed it, and I'll be using it to complete this drawing. Now I've painted the green leaf, let's do a blue sky. Now that the leaf area is dry, I can start building up the colour with some dry pigment. Sticks of soft pastels come in handy to draw lines and details on the leaf. Again, we're going back and forth, building up colour and blending, adding details and creating shadows. So we have a little caveat here when using glue with our pastels. You may find that the glue has spilled over into unexpected areas, as it is in this case. This will make it difficult for the pastel to adhere to the surface. I'm trying to colour parts of the shell with pastel pencils, but it's not really working because the glue is getting in the way. But as I always say, artists are problem solvers. I recently bought a set of acrylic markers, and of course, as I love to experiment, I tried them out on this drawing. They, in fact, were a lifesaver. They worked a treat. Let's take a look at it. Look at this. I can even cover over a mistake I made with the acrylic marker with a stick of white pastel. I'm using the dark green and the white to work on the snail's shell. The glue is no match for them. This little snail has a beautiful, simple silhouette, but to make it really work, I need to add lots of detail. The dark green and light blue acrylic markers work wonders for creating details on the snail's skin. If you need great royalty-free images, Pastels is a great place to start. That's where I got this reference image for the snail. A touch of acrylic marker in a bowl, and I can continue to paint intricate details. What's great about the acrylic marker is that it doesn't create a shiny surface. It creates a kind of textured matte surface, which makes it easy to lay a pastel pigment onto. I can now add some little hints of colour around the shell and add a few highlights. The snail's skin has so many fine details, but with the use of an acrylic marker and a well-sharpened pastel pencil, I think we've got it. In order to get the paint out of the acrylic marker, I simply press down with it in a bowl and voila, that easy. I can now use my brush pen and paint with it. So my original plan was to do all 12 techniques in one drawing, but I think that was a little ambitious. So I decided to do 3 drawings, and I think they really illustrate just what you can do with PanPastels, soft pastels, and everyday artist tools and materials. There were a couple of techniques that I didn't get to use in this video. Can you guess which ones? But I will be using those in some upcoming videos, so stay tuned. Now for the fun part. It's always so satisfying when you do a big reveal and take the masking tape off. This is something that happens quite often when you take off tape, and that's why you have to be extra careful. But it's nothing that a little pastel pencil cannot fix. So there we go, guys, my beautiful little snail. It's actually a large snail. And here we have all 3 drawings. It was really fun doing these, and it really emphasizes just how versatile PanPastels and soft pastels are. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to like, share, subscribe. Wishing you much love. Peace.